Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is where we take a look at some of the foundational arguments and deep sources of Christian theology, and, well, we try to break them down for today.
And today, we're getting into a discussion that is, I think, one of the most significant paradoxes you can find. It's this question of God's self-revelation.
Right, the idea that God has revealed himself with such unbelievable clarity, so visibly all over the place, that nobody really has an excuse for not knowing him.
Exactly, no excuse. And yet, the second part of that paradox is that humanity consistently just fails to get it, fails to grasp that truth.
It really is the paradox of knowledge, isn't it? We're going to be looking at that tension, the massive scale of this divine revelation on one hand, and then the deep internal failure of human beings to process it correctly.
And our source material for this is drawing from some classic Christian theology on what's called general revelation, so God revealing himself in creation, and also in his ongoing governance of the world.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really pull out the core arguments that define humanity's spiritual status.
We need to get a handle on the argument that says human beings were designed for a perfect, almost intuitive knowledge of God, but have become so corrupted by these internal flaws, the sources use a very direct word, dullness, that this huge universal revelation, it only ends up producing guilt.
Universal guilt. So we're going to try and extract those core arguments. We want to understand the amazing three-part way God discloses himself, what the sources call the insignia of his glory.
And then after that, we have to analyze in detail the internal spiritual sickness that makes all that dazzling external light completely unprofitable for us.
We need to explain how the mirrors work and then why we still can't see our reflection correctly.
That's a great way to put it. And that structure is key. We have to start by establishing this principle of accountability. The sources are clear. God has deliberately put these visible insignia, these signs of his glory, absolutely everywhere.
It's not a passive thing then. It's an active display.
It is an active, constant display. And we can, for our discussion, sort of organize these displays into three main areas or three manifestations.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack this, starting with the first one. The external revelation. The universe itself, it's often called a divine mirror.
A divine mirror. And the scale of God's workmanship is the first proof. This isn't just a he created it and left kind of argument. It's that God daily discloses himself in how the universe runs.
Right. The argument is that his glory is engraved with unmistakable marks on everything. Every single created work. It's inescapable.
It is. And what's really interesting here is how quickly the argument connects this to human accountability. It doesn't matter who you are, what your education is, or where you live.
And that gets to the question I was just thinking, is this revelation just for, philosophers or scientists? And the answer is a hard no.
A very hard no. The source material is so explicit on this. It says these marks are so prominent that even, and this is a direct quote, unlettered and stupid folk cannot plead the excuse of ignorance.
That sets an incredibly high universal bar for guilt, doesn't it? Just based on the fact that you exist in this universe.
It's a huge claim, and it has to be, because if the revelation is clear enough to remove the excuse from the simplest person, then it must just be overwhelming. This is why the cosmos is described in such grand language.
Yeah, you see things like the heavens being called God's royal tent or his palace. Creation is like God's visible clothing.
I like that image. And the skillful ordering of the universe is presented as a sort of mirror. It's what lets us contemplate God, who is, otherwise invisible to our physical eyes.
So how does this mirror actually work? What is it that's doing the speaking, so to say?
It speaks in a language that is known to every nation. It's not a human language, obviously. It's the language of order, of design, of consistency.
So the testimony is universal.
Completely universal. The source calls it an attestation of divinity so apparent that it ought not to escape the gaze of even the most stupid tribe. You look up at the stars, you see the seasons change with perfect regularity. You're witnessing an organized system that just screams for an intelligent organizer.
That cuts right through any language barrier. It's creation speaking for its creator. And the divine wisdom, as you said, it's displayed in a couple of ways, right? The incredibly complex and the totally common.
Precisely. God's wonderful wisdom is seen first in what the sources call recondite matters. Think astronomy. The stuff that requires specialized knowledge, detailed observation.
Like calculating the motion of stars, their distance, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And the more you study that, the more the artificer's skill just blows you away.
That makes a lot of sense. The deeper you go, the more incredible the design appears. But the sources are careful to balance that with, everyday observation.
They have to. Most people aren't astronomers, but they can still see the innumerable and yet distinct and well-ordered variety of the heavenly host.
Right. You don't need a telescope to be amazed by the night sky or to see the logic in a plant growing.
Not at all. The arrangement of the cosmos just thrusts itself upon you. It's a deliberate, abundant, inescapable display of God's wisdom. Nobody is left out of the classroom.
Okay, so that's the first manifestation. The external universe is this huge, undeniable mirror. But the sources then say there's no need to go outside ourselves to comprehend God. This seems to be the second manifestation.
That's right. If the cosmos is the macro-level mirror, then humanity is the microcosm, a little world in miniature that reflects the Creator's glory.
Man is called a rare example of God's power, goodness, and wisdom, and he contains enough miracles to occupy our minds. So the evidence isn't just out there. It's in here, intimate.
It's an intimate internal reality. It's embedded in our very being.
That is a very strong theological claim. If we are microcosms, it's like we're specifically engineered to register this divine truth. What are the proofs they point to? What are the internal mechanisms?
Well, you can break it down into two main areas, the physical body and the faculties of the soul.
Okay.
So with the body, its very design is seen as evidence of an intelligent artificer. The human bodies, and I'm quoting again, articulation, symmetry, beauty, and use, are described as so ingenious that the artificer is rightly judged a wonder worker.
Just the basic functions of our biology, the ability to move, to see, to heal, it points to a design that's far beyond just random chance.
It does. And the sources would say that the soul, or the mind, gives even clearer testimony.
And what is it about the soul's faculties that makes them such undeniable signs of divinity?
Well, think about the agile motions of the soul, its excellent faculties, these rare gifts. The soul can survey the heavens not just by looking up, but by understanding, by calculating.
Right. It can connect the past to the future through memory and foresight. It devises incredible things.
The ability to reason, to remember, to invent, to imagine. All of these things go beyond the strictly physical. They are listed as unfailing signs of divinity in man.
And also signs of immortality. They separate us from the rest of creation. It's through these qualities that God testifies. He's our Father, by adorning us with such great excellence.
And this all ties back to an internal feeling. The sources insist that each person undoubtedly feels within the heavenly grace that quickens him. There is this built-in internal awareness, what some call the seed of religion, or the conscience, that points back to the author.
So even if you refuse to look at the stars, the evidence is still right there inside you.
You can't escape it.
So even through the cosmic revelation, the external mirror, we have the internal human revelation, the microcosm. But God isn't some distant clockmaker. The third manifestation is about his active, continuous involvement, providence, and governance.
This is the dynamic evidence. This is God in action right now. He sustains the infinite mass of heaven and earth by his word at every moment.
It's not on autopilot.
Not at all. His control is absolute. He can shake the heavens with thunderbolts, stirp the air with storms, hold the sea as if in midair, and then just as quickly clear it all away with his nod alone. It proves the system is run by a sovereign will, not some impersonal force.
And that sovereignty reaches directly into human society. We see his character on display every day. He administers the world, showing his clemency to the godly and his severity to the wicked and criminal through what the sources call open and daily indications.
Right. We see his providence most clearly when he overturns what we might just write off as, chance occurrences or bad luck.
Like what?
For instance, a poor person suddenly finding help, a lost person finding their way home, a prisoner being unexpectedly freed, or someone getting better from a sickness that seemed hopeless. These are all cited as just so many proofs of heavenly providence, and specifically his fatherly kindness.
They show his active, caring hand. He's not distant. He's near and familiar.
And this means he's not just the great architect, but also the active governor who gets involved in human affairs, down to the small details of our lives. His wisdom is also on display in how he deals with human plans and schemes.
How so?
Well, he dispenses everything at the best opportunity, and he has this way of catching the crafty in their own craftiness. He lets human wisdom and our clever plans fail in spectacular fashion.
And by doing that, he proves that he's the one tempering everything in the best way.
Exactly. When you see the innocent succeed against the odds or the schemer's plans fall apart, from this theological view, that's concrete, visible proof of his governing wisdom.
So to just quickly recap the first part of our deep dive, we've set up this theological foundation for universal accountability. God has revealed himself externally in the cosmos, internally in the human soul, and actively in history through his providence. The evidence is abundant, clear, and just totally inescapable.
And that brings us to the big pivot, the great but. If the evidence is so dazzling, if these mirrors are everywhere and they're so clear, why is there so much spiritual darkness? Why is humanity still in the state it's in?
And this, of course, is where we get into the doctrine of human corruption. Section 2, the spiritual malady.
The sources describe humanity as being deeply flawed, suffering from a spiritual stupidity and dullness. And it's this dullness that completely cancels out the good effect of all that clear revelation we just talked about.
The problem shifts. It's not about the clarity of the light anymore. It's about the inability of the eye.
Let's focus on that, the core spiritual flaw, dullness and stupidity. God represents himself with very great clarity, but human stupidity causes people to grow increasingly dull towards so manifest testimonies.
So the clear revelation, instead of soaking in and leading to adoration, it flows away without profiting us.
That's a key distinction. The light source isn't weak. The recipient is corrupted. The human response is one of active idleness, a disregard. People sit idly in contemplation of his works, but they just don't think about the author.
They look at the beautiful building, but forget all about the architect who designed it.
Right. And this dullness isn't just passive, it's a willful spiritual disability. It changes how we see the world. So instead of seeing God's active hand in providence, many people just reckon that men are whirled and twisted about by blindly indiscriminate fortune.
They just swap out divine orchestration for random
Yes,
chaff.
they do. And that's where the moral problem really kicks in. This refusal to acknowledge God leads straight to what the sources call the corruption of ingratitude and pride.
Okay, so we're given this workshop graced with God's unnumbered works and inestimable riches, everything we need to give praise. But instead of being thankful, humans become puffed up and swollen with all the more pride.
It's a total reversal of the intended purpose. A human being takes the very gifts that were meant to point back to the giver, our intelligence, our bodies, our food, and uses them to build up the self. And this ingratitude is described as an active suppression of the truth. It's aggressive.
How does that suppression work? What does it mean when it says, they bury in the earth that which enlightens their minds to see God clearly?
It means they actively claim for themselves what has been given them from heaven. They take the glory for themselves. They credit their own amazing structure, their intelligence, their success. They credit it to their own merit or their own ingenuity or just luck, instead of the divine source.
The source material calls this foul ungratefulness.
It's a strong term. They don't just forget God, they substitute themselves for God.
And this active rejection is necessary because God's hand is so visible. So to keep their pride intact, they have to obscure or overturn his daily acts by wickedly judging them. They have to snatch away God's glory by misinterpreting his works.
Which leads us to the main theological conclusion of this section, the inexcusable status. This is such a critical point in Reformed theology about accountability after the fall. A human being now lacks the natural ability to mount up into the pure and clear knowledge of God. The mind is broken, the spiritual eye is blind.
But, and here's the paradox again, that inability doesn't give us an excuse. Why not? I mean, if a person is genuinely unable to do something, how can you hold them accountable for failing?
Because the corruption is internal, it's culpable, it's a self-inflicted wound. The inability isn't some external limit like being locked out of a room. It's an internal corruption of our will and our intellect that came from sin.
So because of that, all excuses cut off because the fault of dullness is within us.
We don't fail because God was obscure. We fail because we actively broke the very mechanism that was designed to see him.
The spiritual failure isn't some tragic accident. It's a guilty condition, which means our own conscience is always acting like an internal prosecutor.
That's it. The conscience always convicts us of both baseness and ingratitude. Even when our minds are busy rationalizing away the truth, that little seed of religion, that moral compass, it's testifying against us. It confirms our guilt.
And that's why the defense of, pretending you didn't know, I didn't have the ears to hear, the eyes to see, it's just dismissed out of hand.
It's seen as ridiculous when mute creatures with more than melodious voices and eyeless creatures are all declaring God's truth.
The universe is shouting God's glory so loudly that we have to actively, culpably plug our ears to ignore it.
Yes. So the ultimate function of this general revelation is not to save us, because our internal corruption stops that from happening, but to make sure that no one can stand before the Creator and claim they didn't know. It's the testimony that establishes universal guilt.
So we started with this dazzling clarity, and now we see that clarity is met with willful blindness and inescapable guilt, which brings up a new question. What happens to that little seed of religion, that initial spark of divinity in the mind, when it gets corrupted by all this dullness and pride? Where does that corrupted truth go?
It goes directly into what the next section calls the labyrinth of error. Since human beings can't hold on to the clear truth that's been revealed, their flawed minds immediately start inventing false systems, false gods, to fill the void.
The human mind, which was supposed to be a perfect mirror, instead becomes a labyrinth. Once people get this rash conception of some sort of divinity, something born from their own imagination, they immediately fall back into the ravings or evil imaginings of our flesh and corrupt by our vanity the pure truth of God.
A labyrinth is the perfect image for it. It's confusion, it's endless paths that lead nowhere, it's darkness. The human mind, because it fails to grasp the simple truth of the one God, descends into a boundless, filthy mire of error.
And out of that mire comes an immense crowd of gods.
An immense crowd. This is the theological explanation for the origin of all idolatry. Every person becomes their own god-maker. They fashion for himself an idol or specter in place of God by inventing their own version of divinity, one that's maybe more comfortable for their pride or easier for them to control.
And the sad conclusion, across all cultures and all of history, is that everyone, one and all, they forsake the one true God for prodigious trifles.
Prodigious trifles. That phrase is so powerful. They abandon the infinite, living, sovereign creator for ridiculous self-made nonsense.
And it's important to show that this failure isn't just limited to what some might call primitive societies. This failure is just as obvious in the highest levels of human philosophy.
Oh, absolutely. We have to look at the philosophical and theoretical errors of even the most brilliant human minds. The sources are very critical of intellectual pride. It's not just the uneducated who fall into this. It's the sharpest minds who fail spectacularly when they rely only on their own reason to figure out God.
Can you give us an example from the sources?
Well, think about the critique of Plato. He's called the most religious of all and the most circumspect. So he's given credit for being the serious thinker. But even he, when he tries to define God, he wanders and stumbles. He gets lost.
He vanishes in his round globe of abstract ideas.
Right. The definition he comes up with is confusing. It's not a God you can actually worship. It's just an idea.
So even the greatest thinkers of the ancient world, the ones with higher wit and keen discernment, they still show stupidity and silliness when they're faced with heavenly mysteries. This shows the failure is systemic. It's in human nature itself, not just a lack of brain power.
Exactly. And the intellectual errors often take the form of substituting the created world for the creator. Some just suppress God's name and replace it with nature as the artificer of all things. They'll admit there's order, but they deny the personal sovereign God behind that order.
The sources are critical of Aristotle's view of the soul being tied to the body, calling it a frigid statement. Why is that specific philosophical idea so theologically bad?
Because it limits the scope of God's work, and more to the point, it suffocates those signs of immortality and divinity we were just talking about in the human microcosm. By tying the soul only to physical processes, it denies our spiritual capacity and the transcendent reality that points to a personal creator. It reduces God's involvement to just cold, abstract laws of nature.
And this substitution often creates what the sources call a shadow deity. These ideas about a universal mind which animates and quickens the world, or some secret inspiration that gives life to the whole universe. You find these in some classical poets. They're criticized as jejune speculation and profane.
We have to understand why these ideas, which can sound very sophisticated and spiritual, are called profane. It's because this kind of philosophical speculation confuses God with his own works. It reduces the universe to its own creator, blurring the line between the architect and the building.
They create a shadow deity to drive away the true God whom we should fear and adore.
So whether it's through crude, physical idols or sophisticated philosophy, the result is the same. The true God is abandoned for a substitute, usually one that human reason has cooked up.
And this philosophical error has huge practical results.
It does. The sources point out that the confused diversity of opinions among the wise, all the endless squabbling over the names and nature of God, it actually emboldens people who are already inclined to be impious.
This leads to the ultimate rejection of God. You mean groups like the Epicureans?
Exactly. The confusion among the wise emboldens Epicureans and other crass despisers of piety to cast out all awareness of God. They look at the mess of all these different philosophical systems, and they just conclude it's better to deny God exists at all than to fashion uncertain gods and get into endless quarrels.
That's a terrible irony. Human reason, which was supposed to see God in creation, ends up justifying atheism because of its own internal contradictions.
And this failure also extends to organized religion that isn't divinely revealed, what the sources call the rejection of a humanly contrived religion. All who corrupt pure religion by following their own opinions, they separate themselves from the one and only God.
So even if they say they're worshiping God, if the source of that worship is human imagination and not divine instruction, it's condemned.
The critique is aimed right at human authority defining what is sacred. The Holy Spirit rejects all cults contrived through the will of men as base. And the reason is that opinion humanly conceived in heavenly mysteries is nevertheless the mother of error.
Human authority is just too weak a foundation for real piety.
Right. When humans decide how God should be worshipped, they inevitably make a god in their own image, according to their own preferences and limits. And in doing that, they substitute demons or specters for the true God.
So this built-in inability to grasp the truth means that humanity's default setting, if it's taught only by nature, is to worship an unknown God, which is called a no-light fault.
The mind's failure leads to two equally condemned places. Either total philosophical denial, like the Epicureans, or the invention of self-made religion, which is idolatry. The big picture is that the mirror of creation establishes our accountability, but the internal dullness of our minds ensures that we only see our own reflection in the broken pieces.
The state of humanity, then, is inexcusable guilt and confusion. So, if general revelation, the clarity of God's works, isn't enough to save, what was its real purpose? And what's the right goal for seeking God? This has to lead us into our final section.
It does. We're shifting our view now from the problem to the intended destination, which can only be reached through faith. Let's start with the final goal of knowledge. The sources state very plainly that the final goal of the blessed life rests in the knowledge of God.
So God's self-disclosure, whether it's external in creation or internal in us, is ultimately an invitation. It's meant to invite all of humanity to recognition of Him, and from this to true and complete happiness.
He reveals Himself so that we might respond with love and worship and obedience. This knowledge, if it's received correctly, should arouse us to the worship of God. It should make us look unto Him, direct our faith to Him, and worship and call upon Him.
And this is so critical. True theological knowledge is never meant to be just empty speculation that merely flits in the brain.
Right.
It has to be sound and fruitful. It must take root in the heart.
Right. Which means the right way to pursue this knowledge is not through some bold intellectualism, which we just saw leads to error. The right way is defined by humility.
So the most perfect way of seeking God is not to try with bold curiosity to penetrate to the investigation of His essence.
No, we have to recognize our limits. His essence is something we ought more to adore than meticulously to search out.
So instead of trying to define the undefinable, the focus should be on observation and adoration.
Exactly. The way forward is to contemplate Him in His works. This is how He renders Himself near and familiar to us, and in some manner communicates Himself. Our contemplation should hold our mental powers suspended in wonderment, and it should stir us deeply. It should lead to adoration, not to self-justifying philosophical games.
Okay, and moving on to Providence. We need to touch on the question of seemingly random events, or more specifically, the problem of justice in this life. Why does God let righteous people suffer and wicked people prosper, even though we've said He actively governs everything?
This introduces the hope of the future life. The sources explain that the examples we see of God's clemency and His severity in this life are inchoate and incomplete. And that word inchoate is key. It means partial, or just begun but not finished.
So God's governance here on earth is like a preview, not the main feature.
That's a perfect way to put it. They're partial displays, not the full exhibition of His righteousness. And there's a reason. If every single sin were punished immediately in this life, we would just assume there's nothing left for the end, and the need for a future judgment would be gone.
And on the other hand,
if no sin were ever punished now, we'd conclude there's no providence at all, that the world just runs on chance.
So the current state of imperfect justice is necessary to prove two things at the same time. That God is involved, but that He's saving the final, complete justice for later.
That's why we have to conclude that these examples presage even greater things. Since we see good people suffer while wicked people often get away with things for a time, we are forced to look beyond this life for the resolution.
This partial knowledge pushes us to believe that there will be another life in which iniquity is to have its punishment and righteousness is to be given its reward. The very imperfection of justice in this world is itself a proof of a coming judgment.
It is. It's a mechanism designed to pull us toward the hope of the future. It acts as a kind of theological engine, propelling us out of being satisfied with the present and into an expectation of what's to come. We know God isn't random, but we see these imbalances every day, which forces us to conclude that the scales will eventually be balanced perfectly.
And that brings us full circle back to the initial problem, the dullness of the human mind. Even if we understand the purpose of general revelation is for accountability and the goal of knowledge is for worship, the human condition still needs something more than creation itself. We arrive at the need for inner faith.
We establish that the bare and simple testimony of creation is not sufficiently instructed for humans to get to a pure and clear knowledge of God that leads to salvation. While the universe strikes some sparks of truth in us, those sparks are smothered before their fuller light shines forth, all because of our human dullness.
So what does this inner faith do that looking at the stars cannot?
It corrects the eye. Here's the key conclusion. The invisible divinity is made manifest in such spectacles, but that we have not the eyes to see this unless they be illumined by the inner revelation of God through faith.
Without that illumination, the work of the Holy Spirit, we're just stuck. Stuck in confused ideas, in the labyrinth of error, in the default mode of substituting ourselves for God.
The external evidence is necessary, but it's not sufficient. It's the light, but we don't have the ability to see it properly.
Exactly. So the manifestation of God in nature does not go farther than to render them inexcusable. It doesn't lead them into the correct saving path on its own.
The clear light of creation serves to establish universal guilt and accountability, while the inner light of faith is what's required to restore our sight, to correct the mind's broken mirror, and to get to true saving knowledge and worship.
That distinction, inexcusable versus saved, that's so essential to understanding this whole theological framework we've been talking about. God's self-disclosure sets the terms of accountability, but only faith gives us the ability to really see and respond to that disclosure in the right way.
It really shows the radical nature of the human spiritual condition. We are not innocent just because we're ignorant. We are actively rebellious, and we are incapable of fixing our own vision. This makes a sovereign act of illumination necessary to restore our sight and correct the faulty labyrinth of the mind, letting us finally see the mirror of creation for what it truly is.
We've covered a lot. We've explored the dazzling mirror of creation, the inherent dullness of the human microcosm, the labyrinth of error and idolatry that results, and then finally, the need for inner faith to correctly interpret that revelation. All while understanding that incomplete justice in this life points us toward future glory.
I think what stands out the most is that tension we started with. The Creator has done everything necessary on the outside to be known, yet the creature has done everything possible on the inside to deny or substitute that knowledge. And in doing so, we ensure our own inexcusability and our need for spiritual intervention.
So here's a final thought for you to take away. If the purpose of God's justice being inchoate and incomplete in this world is to draw us toward the hope of the next, what specific, seemingly random event in your life right now, something that doesn't quite add up or seems unfair or maybe even an undeserved blessing, what if that is God's governance, pointing you toward that eternal reward? Ponder the incomplete justice you experience today and what promise it holds for the life to come.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time, keep thinking.
Reformed thinking.